Alright, so now getting into these next couple of videos, we're going to take a look at some of the different advanced controls in JavaFX. For this video and the next one, we're going to be looking at the radio button and the checkbox control. The way that I want to approach this is we're going to do a single application that actually takes advantage of both of these. And what I want to do is something that's a bit more practical, at least in terms of the expected functionality. Obviously, the way that we're going to approach this is far more simple than what you would expect to see in the real world. So we're going to go ahead and make a new project or new program for this. And the thing that I want to go ahead and test out here is something that allows us to see the usage of both radio buttons and control or checkboxes in a single application. So a really simple example of this that you are likely pretty familiar with is going to be an application that would allow you to select a couple of different options, things like the preparation and the toppings for pizza. So the application itself, we're going to make it something like Pizza Maker. So in this case, I'm making a Java file, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So again, going through the general setup for a JavaFX application, we're going to need our usual imports. So we're going to go ahead and bring in the application class. We'll bring in the stage class, and we'll bring in the scene class. Additionally, we're going to go ahead and bring in a VBox. So we'll get that from our layout package. And for this first one, we're going to be taking a look at the radio button class. So we'll go ahead and import that control as well. So just like our label, our button, and our text field, this is going to come from the control package, and this is going to be a radio button. And then in addition to the radio button class, I also want to go ahead and bring in the label class. Okay. So the way that this is going to work is I'm going to be creating a couple of different options that are associated with a set of radio buttons, and the idea is that whenever you click one of these radio buttons, it will choose a particular option and then display the results of the option that you've selected with this label. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to need is to start setting up the class itself. This is going to be a public class Pizza Maker. This is going to extend application so that we can go ahead and access the launch and the start methods. We'll have a public class, a public static void main, our arguments. We'll call the launch method, and then we'll have the start method with our stage in it. And then from here, we can go ahead and get started on the more interesting parts, the stuff that'll make this unique for this particular application. So the first thing I want to go ahead and set up is going to be the different radio buttons I'm going to be using for this. So in the case of radio buttons, since this is related to trying to make a pizza, the way that I want to approach this is that I'm going to have 3 different radio buttons for 3 different kinds of crusts that we could pick from. And then when I get into checkboxes in the next video, I'm going to use a set of checkboxes for different toppings that we could put on it. And the reason that I want to take this approach, if you're familiar with the kind of expected functionality between a radio button and a checkbox, generally the way that a radio button works is that you'll have a set of these, and whenever you select one of them, that will kind of deselect the rest, so you can only select one radio button within a particular group at a time. And this group that we're selecting from is going to be what's known as a toggle group, and this is going to be another thing that we have to import. So in addition to the radio button, coming back up to my imports, I'm going to go ahead and import another control, and this is going to be the toggle group. Okay. So now that we've imported the toggle group as well, we'll go ahead and start putting together all of the code to actually create some radio button options. So we're going to have a radio button. So this is going to be for 3 different kinds of crusts. So the ones that I'm interested in, let's say we have something like a traditional crust. We'll just call it dried crust. Is equal to a new radio button. And then similar to the buttons where you could put some text here to specify a label that goes into it, we can also put some text here for a little label that's placed beside the radio button. So this will be for traditional crust. We'll have another radio button. This one can be for, say, a thin crust. This will be another radio button object, be thin crust. And then finally we'll have our third radio button, and this one can be for stuffed crust. Okay. And then the last thing I need to go ahead and do is actually make a toggle group for this. So we're going to have a toggle group object. We'll call this crust group. This is equal to a new toggle group. And then right here I need to go ahead and start adding each one of these buttons to it. And in order to do that, we're going to use a particular method for the buttons themselves, where we can set them to a particular toggle group. So I want to make sure that these are actually in this. So we're going to put our trad crust dot set toggle group, and we'll put it into the crust group. We'll then have our thin crust set toggle group. This is going to be again in the crust group. And then finally we have our stuffed crust, set our toggle group, and put that into the crust group as well. Okay. Alright, so now that we've got all that set up, the next thing I want to go ahead and do is also make sure that we've got our label. So I'll have our label. This one is going to be the end results of all of the stuff related to our crusts and our toppings. So for right now, this is just going to be for the crusts. We'll call this something like output. Okay, so equal to a new label. And then for right now, the only thing we're really worried about is the kind of crust we've chosen. So we'll say you have selected the, and then I need an option right here to specify the kind of crust that's been selected. And then the rest of it. So we're going to kind of concatenate some things together. So we need to do something with this variable that is specified here called crust. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I want to do about that. So the idea here is that I need to determine which one of these options has been selected. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to say that the trad crust, and I need to use another method, which is the setSelected method. And with this method, I can actually specify the which one of these I want to set to be selected initially when the application first starts. I'll go ahead and put in a boolean here to set this to true. So this will make sure that the trad crust radio button is selected when the application first starts. And then the other thing I want to go ahead and do is also get a particular string depending on which one of these is selected. And to do that, in this case, because of the fact that we're going to make sure that the trad crust is selected initially, we'll just go ahead and set this string called crust equal to traditional for right now. And then we're going to go ahead and modify a little bit of that as we go. So the idea here is that whenever we change one of these radio buttons, we want something that allows us to modify this. The string here. So first we'll take a look at what the functionality is going to be. So we'd say something like if a particular radio button is selected. So we have another method that we can use with our radio buttons. So we'll grab the trad crust first, and we're going to use the isSelected method. And this isSelected method is going to return either true or false depending on whether or not that particular radio button is selected. So we're just going to use that within this boolean expression, and then we'll just say, if trad crust.isSelected, if that's true, then we want to go ahead and take our crust, that string variable that we made, and we're going to go ahead and make sure that that's still just set to traditional. Otherwise, so we'll say else if the thin crust.isSelected, then we can go ahead and say our crust is equal to thin, and then if neither of those is selected, we'll just say else if the stuffed crust dot is selected, then our crust should be equal to stuffed. Okay. Okay. And then the last thing I want to go ahead and start doing now is being able to take each one of these and actually start putting in each one of these components, each one of these pieces that I've created here. I want to start putting this into an additional piece of code that will check to see whenever one of these radio buttons becomes selected. So the way that that's going to work is that whenever we select or deselect a particular radio button, it's a lot like clicking a button. So we saw before, back in chapter 12, or in the previous set of videos related to more basic controls, we saw that there was that whole setup for being able to cause an event to occur, creating an event handler to capture the event and then perform some kind of operation, registering that event to a button, and then how that entire process, when it's all combined together, is what's known as event firing. So we can do something very similar with radio buttons. So what we can go ahead and do right here is go ahead and set up a piece of code where we can say something like, let's say, starting with the first one, so we'll have trad crust. We want to go ahead and use the setOnAction method. So just like our buttons before, we're going to use setOnAction. And for each one of these, to keep this fairly simple, since we're only going to have these 2 lines of code for each one of these different radio buttons, I'm just going to use a lambda expression to do this. So we know that we're going to need the name of it, which is event, for the parameter. We use that arrow notation, and then I'm going to have a pair of curly braces to start the body of the method that this lambda expression is implementing. And within the body, all I need to do is just take these 2 lines right here and move them into that. So just go ahead and place that there. And then I just want to go ahead and repeat this process for each of the other 2 buttons as well. So I'll have thin crust dot is selected. We'll have our event, our arrow, create the body for the method, and then I just need the if portion of this. We can remove the else. And then finally for stuffed crust, we'll do is selected. We'll have our event, create our body, and then we just need this little bit of code here. Okay, so briefly going through this, essentially the way this is going to work is that we're going to use a setOnAction so that every time a particular button is either selected or deselected, either one of those 2 actions could cause the event to fire. So we want to make sure that we check to see that, whenever this action, when this event occurs, we're then going to check to make sure that the event occurred because that button, that radio button, was selected. So we're going to do this little check right here, and if that ends up being true, then we can go ahead and assign something to our string. And then, of course, the last thing I need to go ahead and do, in addition to modifying the string, is to make sure that there's an update to the contents of this label. So one extra little line that I need to include for each one of these is going to be this output.setText. And for that, I need to go ahead and, let's remove that, just update the text again. Okay. And this is just to make sure that whenever I select a new button, that the text inside of the label actually is being updated. Otherwise, the string will change, but the text in the label isn't really going to be affected by that. So go ahead and put in that, save it, and then finally I want to go ahead and start setting up the VBox and the scene and the stage. So next we're going to need our VBox. This is equal to another VBox. This will be equal to a new VBox object. And for this VBox, we'll do something like, let's just do 5 pixels of spacing for this. And then we're going to put in the 3 radio buttons and the label. Keep in mind that the toggle group that I've put these in isn't really its own container. It's really just there for the sake of the functionality of this. It's not really a node that I can place into a container. So we're going to specify each one of these 3 radio buttons. We have our trad crust, our thin crust, and our stuffed crust. And then finally we have our output label. And then the next thing I'm going to need is my scene object. The root of this is going to be the VBox. I'm not going to worry too much about the dimensions for right now. I'll come back to that a little bit later. And then we'll go ahead and set up our stage. So we'll have our primary stage dot set scene. Take that scene object. We'll set the title. So this is going to be our pizza maker. And then finally we'll go ahead and show it. Okay. Alright, so now that we've got everything set up, we'll go ahead and compile this and run it, see that everything is displaying correctly as far as the interface goes, and also test our buttons to make sure that they are behaving the way that we expect them to. Hopefully I didn't make any mistakes as we went through this. So we'll do our pizzamaker.java. So a slight mistake there. And also right there. Make sure that this is the correct method. And then right here for this first one, slight typo there. Okay. Should be everything. Okay, so now this actually gets into another point that I want to address. So something that I haven't really mentioned before about dealing with our event handlers. If we're doing it with, say, private inner classes, anonymous inner classes, or Lambda expressions, we might run into an issue like this, where it's expecting our local variables to be either final or effectively final. Basically what this is telling me is that I've created a variable and I'm trying to modify it in some way. In this case, I'm trying to change it from one string to another, and it's complaining about that. So the easiest way to fix this is to actually just take this string that I created. We're going to remove that and change that to be a global variable. So for private string crust, we'll go ahead and save that, and then that will actually help to address that issue. So we'll go ahead and clear this. Try to compile that again. And now we can actually compile it. Okay. Okay, so now we've got our interface, a little bit small right now. We'll fix that a little bit later. So right now, by default, we select the traditional crust, and we say you have selected the traditional crust. And now, if we click one of these, we can see that this field right here is changing as we select a different radio button. So we now checked the thin crust. That radio button is selected. So our label changes to say you have selected the thin crust. Click the stuffed crust, and you'll see the same change. And if we go back to the traditional crust, we can again see that change. Okay. Alright, so this is going to wrap up everything for radio buttons. In the next video, we'll continue to add on to this application to also incorporate combo boxes into this for the toppings of the pizza.